From the Center for European Reform, this is the CER podcast.
Posons-nous sérieusement la question de l'avenir que nous voulons et ayons tous ensemble le courage de le construire.
Für uns in Deutschland ist das Bekenntnis zum vereinten Europa Teil unserer Staatsräson.
A strong united Europe is a necessity for the world because an integrated Europe remains vital to our international order.
This is the moment for Europe to lead the way towards a new vitality.
Welcome to this week's CER podcast. Today we're going to give you an edited version of an event we had on Tuesday the 22nd of June with Frans Timmermans, the European Commission Vice President in charge of the Green Deal. Then we're going to turn to our Climate and Energy Fellow, Elisabetta Cornago, for a short discussion of the key questions that the event raised. But let me introduce the Timmermans event first. The Commission is putting out various proposals to strengthen incentives to decarbonise in July. That's all under the banner of the Fit for 55 package. And the package includes a proposal for an awkwardly titled, and I always get this wrong, Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism, or CBAM, reform of the EU's emissions trading scheme, which has been long-standing and has been in effect since 2005, and an update to the effort sharing regulation, and alongside various other initiatives too. The CBAM and the ETS reform are the biggest issues, really. Let's take the CBAM first. It will impose costs on EU importers of products from countries that don't have a carbon price. That's to prevent so-called carbon leakage, whereby climate action within the EU leads to more imports from countries who don't act themselves. The ETS reform, on the other hand, is essentially an extension of the ETS into buildings and road transport. Got to remember that these are consumer-facing sectors, and up till now, the ETS system principally covered polluting businesses such as energy generators and heavy industry and domestic aviation and so forth. And I think these two reforms exemplify the risks the Commission and the EU face. On the one hand, there's a possibility of a backlash from other countries over barriers to imports as a result of the CBAM. And on the other, there's domestic opposition from consumers who face higher costs under the ETS reform.
The thing is, when we first embarked on this road based on the Paris Agreement, we thought we could stay on course by reducing our emissions by 2030 with 40% as compared to 1990. Now, science since has taught us that that's not enough, so we need to up the ante, and we came to the conclusion that if we reduce the emissions by 2030 with at least 55%, we could still stay on track for the maximum 1.5 degrees Celsius temperature rise. But it then turns out that if you go from minus 40 to minus 55, that's not just an incremental change. That's a fundamental change in terms of the policy areas you need to look at. That's why we're now coming out in July with the 12 proposals in all these policy areas that you've mentioned.
The Commission's view is the changing science means tougher action in more sectors of the economy. Obviously, this raises problems about fairness and raises the risk of a political backlash because household investment is going to have to go up significantly to meet targets.
In our analysis, we saw that there are three areas particularly difficult to tackle. Housing, the built environment in more general, transport, where the emissions have consistently gone up instead of down over the last years, and agriculture, where, as you know, we have quite complicated negotiations also on the Common Agriculture Policy reform and the farm to fork and biodiversity initiatives we've taken to further help along the farming in a more sustainable way. So when we look at transport, the only way you can decarbonize transport is by, of course, enhancing public transport, emission-free public transport, creating the right infrastructure to make sure you can switch to electric vehicles for cars and vans as soon as possible, that you tighten the emission rules for cars and vans, but that you also provide for the infrastructure that is necessary for charging infrastructure and the underlying production of renewable electricity for that charging infrastructure, that you also look at the way we produce renewable energy, make it more easy to produce renewable energy in the housing sector and built environment. We need to double the efforts to save energy. We now save about 1% a year. That needs to go to 2% a year. You need to elaborate on the ETS system. You need to make it broader. You need to introduce shipping into the ETS system. You could envisage creating an ETS system also for housing and transport. And all of that will be presented to member states and to the parliament. And then, of course, there will be a huge discussion on all the measures separately and also jointly. And it is quite clear which measures will be criticized by whom. But then my question will always be to co-legislators, all right then, but how do you have better plans to get us to the minus 55? If you don't like ETS, how are you going to get there? Through extra taxation or through regulation? What are the consequences of that? What is the best way to organize things in a fair way to make sure the most vulnerable are not affected too much, to make sure that you have the middle classes on board? Things like that will all be part of the debate once we've presented our package in July.
The audience pressed Mr. Timmermans on the question of how to deal with the problem that extending the ETS into consumer-facing sectors raised big questions of fairness. Some people could afford the higher costs this entailed, but others couldn't.
When we have to reach minus 55 in 9 years' time, some tough choices will have to be made. And then you have actually three options. Either you expand or you devise an ETS system for transport and housing. And again, let me repeat, transport is a huge problem because emissions have been consistently going up, not down. So either you try and devise an ETS system for housing and transport, or you use taxation as a method, or you use regulation as a method. But we have to do something to bring emissions down. And then you sort of analyze which system would have the most fair redistributional effects, which system would allow you to correct if need be, which system actually leads to a change in behavior. To give you an example, we tax fuel for cars, but does taxing fuel for cars change the behavior of the oil companies? No, because they don't feel any responsibility for that taxation. That's something that they say we produce it for a certain price, and then the state or the government puts on a tax, and that's not our problem. But if you can create a system whereby it is in the interest of those providing the energy to reduce their CO2 footprint, because it's for them, it's money in the bank, that might be more interesting than taxation or regulation. So these are the things we need to analyze very carefully. And of course, there will be many questions about that. But I always come back to the same point. Minus 55% is something we've agreed. That's now set in law. If you don't want it through an ETS system, so what are you going to do then?
But how would the Commission ensure that poorer people were compensated for higher costs they faced under the ETS? After all, climate action tends to be regressive, with poorer people facing higher costs as a share of their income in reducing their carbon footprint.
What you could do, for instance, when you talk about transport and housing, is you could use part of the proceeds to put it in a social fund, and to use the social fund to help people who are at risk of energy poverty, or to help people whose mobility would be unjustly affected by an ETS system. That would give you the means to show that this transition is just. So we believe that such a fund could be helpful.
My colleague Elisabetta Cornago pointed out that at the moment some sectors, such as manufacturing and aviation, continue to get some of their ETS allowances for free rather than having to buy them at auction. But would the Commission propose getting rid of these free allowances, especially as they interacted with the CBAM? After all, the EU couldn't demand importers buy allowances if domestic producers just simply got them for free.
Well, the free allowances were never meant to be eternal, and there has to be a gradual reduction of free allowances for the ETS system to fully function. but it has to be gradual. You have to give industry the time to adapt. I actually believe I'm more optimistic or more positive than you seem to be about the functioning of the ETS system. I think industry, of course, is placed before a challenge, but they've gotten used to the ETS system. They know how it works. Of course, now that the price has gone up so quickly, some are worried, but it's still functioning very well. And the fact that they've gotten used to it and that it's becoming more and more something that how should I say this? It creates a situation where industry understands that you can link putting a price on carbon with the market mechanism, and that's what they like. And I believe consistently the price per ton will keep rising, and that will help the transition.
Turning to the international scene, I asked Mr. Timmermans whether under Biden the EU had a more willing partner in the US than it had under Trump. How much of an opportunity did he consider Biden's presidency to be? And thinking about the domestic politics in the US, for example, the Senate was at 50-50, and Joe Manchin, the senator from West Virginia, classic coal country, had the casting vote. Also, there was the radicalization of the Republican Party. Also, looking forward to COP26, would other countries believe that the US would keep its promises, given the domestic political scene, and as important, perhaps use its considerable heft to push other countries to act?
Well, I think the fact that the Biden administration has recommitted to the Paris Agreement, has shown great ambition, is of huge help in the international scene, because there are a couple of international players who brought about the Paris Agreement and still feel a level of responsibility for it. The US under Biden is one, but also China. And the US committing to this and being very much engaged in all of this also stimulates China not to, stay absent from the debates. And China's always also said that it would go for net zero by 2060. Now, we still have to see what this means concretely in terms of 5-year plan and other initiatives they might take, but it's a whole different place than a year ago internationally, where people were criticizing the EU for being alone out there. We're no longer alone out there. We've entered into a green alliance with Japan, and Japan has also committed to climate neutrality by 2050. Canada, South Africa is moving quickly. South Korea, a host of countries is moving in the same direction. So that gives us an opportunity. Now, the US is a bit of a complicated case, as you said. Politically, it could go the other way. But even under Trump, with all his withdrawal from Paris, all his rhetoric, etc., the energy transition in the US kept going. Everything he said about coal didn't lead to less closures of coal plants, more even than before, simply for economic reasons. There is no future in coal, whatever the rhetoric says. So even during the Trump years, at state level, in corporate America, at city level, things were moving in the same direction. But of course, on the international scene, the position of the federal government is of huge importance. But Biden doesn't start from scratch, because things had already moved along in several areas in the US at sub-federal level and in corporate America.
The Commission wants to introduce a CBAM, however, which might entail higher barriers for some US imports to the EU, unless the US's carbon regime was considered to be equivalent to the EU's. Wouldn't that cause some trouble?
On the United States, I don't have any indication that the United States would, at this stage, consider introducing its own version of a carbon border adjustment mechanism. Not at this stage, in any case. Having said that, I truly believe that the decarbonization efforts across the Atlantic they might use different instruments, but the putting a price on carbon is what everybody's going to do. And once you put a price on carbon, whether you do it with an ETS system or whether you do it with regulation or taxation, you avoid the problem of carbon leakage. And I honestly believe that the risk of a serious disagreement between the European Union and the United States on carbon leakage is very limited indeed.
He was at pains to stress that the CBAM would be WTO compliant and limited to sectors where carbon leakage was likely to be a big deal.
It's on our shoulders. It's our responsibility at the Commission to analyze very carefully per sector where there is a manifest risk of carbon leakage. And we've been doing that work for over a year and a half, and it is indeed extremely complicated. But at the end of the day, you can look very specifically at a few sectors and identify where concretely the risk of carbon leakage is. It's not frankly a global problem. It then boils down to a quite precise problem. So I'm not that worried about that risk. Of course, carbon border adjustment could mean many things to many people. And I don't exclude that some would see this as the first step towards a more Colbertist Europe. But that's certainly not the intention of the Commission. Very clearly, we want this to be WTO conform. That's what we're working for. I really want this system to be within the WTO rules.
Looking ahead to COP26, Mr. Timmermans was optimistic that other countries understood the risks and were willing to move together to tackle climate change.
The rendezvous was in Glasgow in November, and see what we could do together with our partners to hopefully get the world to embrace the idea that we need to keep global warming well below 2 degrees. And so that's the first rendezvous to prove our point that we can lead together with others to do exactly what you're asking for. Secondly, as I said before, it was quite lonely when we started with the European Green Deal, but somehow also the need to recover after the pandemic has brought home the idea in many countries that we better rebuild in a more sustainable way than where we were before, even in less developed parts of the world, and even in more reluctant countries as far as climate policy is concerned. So I think that has created a more positive dynamic. And at the end of the day, people will not follow the European Union because they think we forced them into doing that. They will follow it when they think this is in their own interest. And where do their interests lie? I think in improving their environment. Many countries act, also big countries, India and China, because they have a serious climate problem internally and environmental problem. They also want to be part of the future of the global markets. And I think rule setting and developing of the global economy, we lead in Europe. In some other areas, others might lead, but in many areas we do lead. And they want to be on this market, even though we're not more than 9% of global emissions. We are an important reference point in terms of market rules and market access. And that helps us also to take others along. And by and large, I believe there's increasing public awareness across the globe of the already horrendous effects of the climate change that has happened. The climate crisis is upon us. It's not something that's going to happen in the future. It's happening. And it's creating I think, a strong political momentum for action. The only worry I have is that if we don't come up with steps soon and show that it can be done, and also show that it can be done in a fair way, then we might be in a situation of climate desperation. People say, okay, this is going wrong in a very serious way, but nothing we can do about this anymore. That's actually a bigger fear I have than climate denial. I think you must be living in a cave somewhere if you're still in climate denial. But the climate desperation is in the increase, and we have to make sure there's no need for that by showing that we can actually still save the day.
Elisabetta Cornago, our climate fellow, is joining us for some more in-depth analysis of some of the things that Mr. Timmermans said. Elisabetta, he was fairly circumspect on some of the details, and so we thought it would be good for you to dig in a bit more on some of the Fit for 55 package and tell us a bit more about the detail. I mean, it's understandable, right? They're going to be coming out with a package in a few weeks' time, and so he's not really at liberty to talk about it in depth. But some things have been leaked. There have been some discussions about what's going to happen. So it'd be great to hear from you on some of those issues. So the first question, I guess, is that Timmermans pretty strongly defended the EU emissions trading scheme from, I think, your question, actually. And he essentially argued that eventually all countries are going to have to introduce some kind of carbon pricing. And that means that the EU's plan to introduce a carbon border adjustment mechanism that's based around the emissions trading scheme is going to be fine. What do we know about the EU's plans for a CBAM, and particularly how do you think those plans are going to come across to some of the partner countries like the US, China, Russia?
Yeah, thank you, John. Those are, very good questions and very sensitive ones at this stage. As you said, there has been quite a substantial leak recently about the carbon border adjustment mechanism. And so we know a little bit of what it might look like, but of course we have to take that with a pinch of salt. So in a nutshell, CBAM is going to be connected to the EU emissions trading scheme. And this type of fee that would apply to importers would actually zoom in on a subset of the sectors which are interested by the ETS. So the Commission has selected a set of sectors which are likely particularly exposed to foreign competition and as such more at danger of suffering from carbon leakage. And these are electricity, iron and steel, cement, aluminium, and some fertilizers. Of course, this is going to be probably just stage 0, let's say, of CBAM. And we know that the Commission has in mind a 3-year sort of transition period to phase in these complex mechanism into the broader, artillery of policy packages that are in place in climate action, see how that works out, and possibly then expand it to more heavy industry sectors which are contained under the EU ETS. So what would that look like? On one hand, an importer that comes from a country that imports from a country that implements a similar carbon price to the one that we see under the ETS is going to enjoy a reduction in the price to pay with respect to the CBAM allowances. But on the other hand, if the import comes from a country that has no comparable carbon price at all, then of course that's the precise reason to have a CBAM in place, to create a level playing field between domestic industry and external competitors, and price imports in order to bridge that gap between the EU ETS carbon price and an existing or exceedingly low carbon price abroad. That is ultimately the whole rationale behind CBAM. Now, it's a bit more complex than that in the sense that, of course, the price of CBAM allowances need to reflect the carbon content of imports. And so there will be a lot of administrative burden around this piece of regulation because importers need to certify the amount of basically carbon embedded in the goods that they are importing. And that has to be done by independent experts. So that's a lot of complexity that's partly required, right, to understand how carbon intensive goods coming into the EU are. And that provides a strong incentive, I guess, for trade partners of the EU to try and link their climate policies to the EU ETS somehow. Certainly a strong incentive for the UK, for example, who has a fairly similar ETS that just recently started.
Okay, great. And I guess another point of discussion in the webinar was the interaction between the free allowances that manufacturing and aviation gets under the emissions trading scheme and how that's going to interact with the CBAM. Because, of course, if you're the US and you're going to get hit by the CBAM for your exports to the EU, but then domestic producers in some areas are getting free allowances, then how is this going to work?
Yeah, you're really putting your finger on one of the big open questions and the trickiest bits, I think, of the design of CBAM as well as of the ETS, right? Because free allowances were already somehow contentious before the arrival of this new kid on the block, CBAM, because they basically amount to a transfer towards heavy industry in order to shield it from, again, the competition of foreign producers of the same goods who are not exposed to stringent climate regulation. So the rationale is that let's give them polluting rights for free for the time being so that this prevents carbon leakage from happening. But of course, if you implement a CBAM's aim, as Timmermans very clearly, tried to explain, is exactly to prevent carbon leakage. And so there is no rationale for having the two things in place at the same time. And in fact, it might be detrimental for the EU to seek WTO approval of the CBAM itself. So we know, and again, this is something that Commissioner Timmermans said himself, there will be a sunset, there will be a phase out of free allowances for heavy industry. Then the big question is how and when. Because again, some of the leaked materials points to 2030 or even 2035 as a sunset date for the free allocation of allowances. And so that seems to me a bit difficult to align with the ambition of the 2030 objective that we have in mind. That's just 9 years away. And if we keep on pushing the can down the road, and if heavy industry is not exposed to the strength of a carbon price signal until 10 years away from now, then that, how is that going to work in terms of ensuring that the decarbonization of these sectors really gets started? That's a complicated policy question that we still have to see details for in upcoming drafts.
Yeah, we'll see what they come up with on July the 14th. And making industrial polluters pay pay for all of their allowances. It's not the only change on the table when it comes to the forthcoming ETS reform, is it? Timmermans talked about expanding the ETS to consumer-oriented sectors. I believe Ursula von der Leyen, the Commission President, has said that they're intending for it to be expanded into transport and into buildings. How would this work, crucially, and perhaps even more crucially? This is moving into consumer-facing sectors of the economy. This is not just heavy industry, big business. So it has the potential to be much more politically controversial, and obviously poorer people are going to find it harder to pay for any increased cost of the carbon that they're responsible for polluting. So how do you address the distributional impacts of expanding the ETS in this way?
Yeah, as you say, so this is going to be complicated both, I guess, from a technical policy design point of view, but above all from the political point of view and social point of view. How do you justify and how do you make this work with the consumers who are going to have to pay ultimately a higher price for their energy consumption, for their fuel consumption, both for driving and for heating their homes. So, in terms of design, we don't know much again, because we have just had some sentences here and there by Commission officials. It seems to be that the Commission is thinking about setting up a separate ETS scheme to cover these two additional sectors. So to somehow, I guess, expose consumers to a different and certainly lower to begin with carbon price with respect to the one that's today, coming out of the existing ETS, which addresses electricity and heavy industry and internal aviation. So that's one thing we know. I guess it kind of makes sense. It would also make sense to connect, right, these two ETSs, so to make sure that there is some kind of parallel evolution in these prices. But we will have to wait and see for the directive to see the technicalities of that. Another question is, who would pay, obviously, the carbon price associated with allowances? Would it be, fuel refineries, retailers? That makes sense. But then what is the aim of this type of expansion of the ETS? Whose behavior do we want to change with this type of carbon price? Is it, the technological refinement of fuels, which takes place in refineries, or is it consumer behavior when it comes to driving as opposed to taking public transport, or is it, changing the way we heat our homes, and ultimately also boosting investment in more efficient technologies? So renovations of homes so that comfort remains the same while energy consumption at home lower. So if that's the ultimate objective, consumer behavior change and efficiency investment, then I think we need to do a bit more, and we need to be very careful about how we use the revenues from this scheme. And this, I guess, tries to answer what you were bringing up in terms of what are the distributional consequences of this type of scheme. Obviously, lower income consumers would be hit harder by this type of intervention, because they spend a higher share of their income on fuel consumption, on driving, on heating their home. And so that needs to be addressed. And Commissioner Timmermans did mention that he has in mind the sort of social fund, which would use, I guess, part of the revenues from these additional ETS to transfer, I guess, some kind of social fund checks to households which are particularly exposed to energy poverty or which are, don't have alternatives to driving when it comes to their mobility needs. So it seems like they have in mind some kind of a very specific type of transfers to vulnerable households, which makes a lot of sense. But I think it would also make sense to think about using part of these revenues to support, again, investment in, let's say, a shift from internal combustion engine cars, traditional cars, to electric vehicles, for example, or even better, encourage people to shift to public transport passes or cycling, and also, boost the renovation wave and encourage people to intervene on the leaky apartments so that their energy bill ultimately gets lowered. So I think there needs to be a discussion around, again, how do we use those revenues? Income transfers are okay, I think, in the short term to obviously address the higher costs, but we need to have longer term solutions to address the technological change that needs to happen there to help consumers also take part in the energy transition.
All right. Well, thanks, Elisabetta. That was really helpful. And thank you to Timmermans and his team for speaking to us. I hope you enjoyed it too, and see you in a couple of weeks for the next edition of the CER podcast.
Thank you for listening to the CER podcast. If you have any feedback for us or want to leave suggestions for a future episode, then you can find us on Twitter at CER_EU.